Hi, and welcome to my talk. Thank you for attending. This is a remote talk. That was not always the plan. Up until yesterday, this was supposed to be an on-site talk, and then a couple of COVID tests changed our plans last minute. So here I am remotely now. But nevertheless, I've brought with you a presentation about documentation first development with a small asterisk from self-isolation now. So the Agile Manifesto basically already tells us working software over comprehensive documentation, right? So basically this is not really a question. Like, yeah, let's just prefer working software and let's ignore documentation. Well, turns out for us, we're producing open source software, and more on that in a second. Ignoring documentation isn't really an option. And whenever we tried working with documentation, that didn't turn out as great as we wanted it to be. So today I'll tell you about the importance of documentation for us and for open source software in general, how we struggled with it, what kind of pain points we had, and also how we overcame them by potentially writing the documentation a bit earlier. So let me quickly start with a couple of words about me. What do I do, and why do I care about documentation, and why do I care about potentially writing documentation before writing any code? About 3.5 years ago, I co-founded a company that's called Semi Technologies, and we've now grown to around 30 people. And as Semi Technologies, we're building open source AI-first infrastructure. And one of these products, or the main product that we have there, is called Weaviate. And Weaviate is an open source cloud native vector search engine. So that's not just the way to win at buzzword bingo. That is actually kind of cool technology, especially in the search space. So all the documentation-based examples and all the kind of experience around documentation and the kind of ideas that we had on documentation are based on Weaviate. So I think it would be good if you have some sort of an understanding of what Weaviate does, or what a vector search engine does. So I brought a tiny little example here. So this round box thing is supposed to be a search bar. So in this search bar, I've put a simple search query. Why do airplanes fly? It's the question. And as you can see, we got a search result, and that's a perfect search result, right? You can see why you should fly with expensive airplanes. So the title alone matched 3 of those keywords. So it was great. And then if you look at the description, fly with expensive fares, modern fleet of airplanes to over 4 destinations. Why do you hesitate? Book now. They're the remaining 4 matches. So obviously this is a great match. Well, maybe not so much. Turns out that the number of keyword matches in a text match isn't necessarily what makes search great. And vector search is the tool basically that comes to your rescue here. So chances are that any of you have used vector search in the past 24 hours. And if not in the past 24 hours, then certainly in the past week. That is because the biggest search engine out there, Google, uses technology that is basically vector search. And one of the applications of vector search is semantic search. So I have another example here. This is actually from Google. I just put this query into Google, and the search results, they may vary, that may be personalized. But the result that I got was dynamics of flight from NASA. So 0 keyword matches in that title, but I still think this is a pretty good search result. Airplane wings are shaped to make air move faster over the top of the wing. When air moves faster, the pressure of the air decreases. So again, no keyword matches, yet Google highlighted this snippet in the same way that the keywords were highlighted before. So somehow Google is basically of the opinion that this is the answer to that question. So it used semantic search technology not to match keywords, but to match the intent of the question. So yay, we get to replace our sad kitten with a happy squirrel because of semantic search. And this is the kind of things that you can do with Weaviate, and Weaviate is fully open source. You can self-host it. But we're not here to talk about vector search. Obviously, that's a topic that I love talking about, and you can interact with me in any way, shape, or form that you like if you want to talk about vector search. I love talking about it. But we are here to talk about documentation. So let's talk about cities. So what you see on the 2 pictures, maybe you recognize them. If you're from Germany, they're from southern Germany. There are 2 cities on these pictures, and the first one on the left, That is the city of Heidelberg. Heidelberg is considered to be absolutely beautiful. It's picturesque. I mean, just look at it. It's like this old style architecture. There's a beautiful castle, which you can't see on the pic because the pic is taken from that perspective of the castle. But yeah, it's full of tourists. People say they love it. It's beautiful. The city on the right, I'm allowed to say this because this is my hometown, is generally considered to be ugly. And the city's name is Mannheim. Mannheim is about 15 kilometers from Heidelberg, or 20 maybe. And it's not a tourist attraction. People, yeah, say these things about Mannheim that are not so pleasant. But there's this one thing about Mannheim. It's a university city. So people come there for a certain period of time in their lives to study. And when they study, the kind of thing that you say in Mannheim is people cry twice. The first time when you enter, well, because it's so ugly, and the second time when you leave, because over time, people actually grow to like the city. They realize it's actually beautiful on the inside, just not on the outside. So what does any of that have to do with documentation? Just like those two cities, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And for open source software, that very first impression tends to be the documentation. So think about some sort of a self-discovering API. It's built in such an intuitive way that you don't need documentation. Users can discover it. Well, if you want to self-host it, how do you start it up? How do you find out, where do you get to that point? Like, even if it's some kind of a Docker container and you can just sort of guess the name of the Docker container and start it up, what do you do then? Most likely at this early point, there is going to be documentation involved. And if the documentation isn't good, people are very likely to drop off that early in the journey. So just to get this straight, when I talk about documentation, mainly today, the focus is going to be on end user facing documentation. So this is something that you would deploy as a website, or we do this in our case, we deploy it as a website, and it's kind of separate from the application, and it tells you how to use it. Of course, documentation is a massive, massive term, and it can span all kinds of different things. And for example, it could be API or code level documentation. So it could be something like Java doc, Go doc, depending on the kind of language you use, or it could be on some internal system where you document your architecture diagram, and these kind of things. For the purpose of my talk, I'm going to talk about the first one, about end user facing documentation. But at the end, let's see if those principles could maybe also apply to other types of documentation. So this would be a typical example of the Weaviate getting started guide, and explicitly chose this example to use this kind of first impression. What would you have to do to really get started with Weaviate? So yeah, we've sort of recognized the importance of that documentation, or we believe we have. So probably you're going to say now, okay, these guys have documentation figured out. They know it's important, so they must have the best documentation in the world, right? Well, we would like to, but and I certainly believe we're getting much, much better at it, but that hasn't always been that way. And there's been plenty of pain points around documentation, and I've grouped them into 4 categories that I want to walk you through right now. Yeah, so that's kind of an embarrassing one, just forgetting about it entirely. And maybe that's a bit obvious, that if you forget about your documentation, that it's not going to be very good. But this is certainly something that happened to us. And maybe not in this sort of, well, we just forgot about it entirely, but maybe in the we prioritized something else, and then we ran out of time, and there were so many other tasks that we needed to do. And yeah, we can do the documentation later. And yeah, we thought we did it, or maybe we didn't. And it turns out, basically, if at some point you get a question from a user about why don't you have that kind of feature, or a feature request, even like implement that kind of feature, and then we go, well, we have that feature. How can that be? And turns out, well, if the feature isn't documented to the user, it doesn't exist. They could make a decision that they can't even use your tool because they just looked at documentation and didn't find your feature, or this particular feature that they care about. Most likely you will have your most obvious features, you will have them documented. And similarly, if the documentation is broken, to the user, the feature might just as well be broken. They don't know that the documentation was just off. To them, the documentation in that case is basically the product. So even if we don't forget about it, sometimes we just had to rush the documentation. I mean, there's all kinds of tools and mindset changes basically that you can do to take the scariness out of a release. Like if you're thinking in a continuous deployment mindset and you have perfect automated tests and perfect test coverage, and the deploy is just a press of a button and everything is easy and self-healing, then certainly that can reduce the kind of stress of such a deployment or a release. But nevertheless, this is always going to be somewhat hectic. Like even in such a small company as Semi that only has 30 people as of now, people need to come together for a release. This is no longer just software. There's marketing involved. There's communications with existing stakeholders. We have a customer success team for people who pay us to use Weaviate. So everything needs to come together, and there are deadlines involved, and sometimes something may go wrong in the last minute. So basically, it's always going to be hectic. And if you purposely wait to write your documentation in that hectic time phase, that may not be the best situation to create high quality documentation. It's probably not the best situation to create high quality anything, but for documentation, this really showed. This one may not be so obvious about how this is about documentation, the lack of context. So basically, if you have a new feature and this feature has maybe also, again, involved multiple teams, maybe there's been a research phase, you've gotten early feedback from your stakeholders, there's a certain amount of context that needs to be passed to the person that's developing it. So especially in my role, sort of as a founder of a startup, where in the beginning we were so few people that the few of us would do everything, and now we're growing the company, and now there's a whole development team, and I'm sort of transitioning from a hands-on role more into a managerial role. Writing good story cards or writing good task descriptions is surprisingly difficult, and sort of setting the right context about how do you tell the developer what they need to know, and how do you not sort of give too much, or how do you not slow them down by giving them unnecessary information. So the right amount there is surprisingly difficult. Speaking of early feedback, we do believe that we're very agile. We do go out and get feedback early. And we are extremely lucky in the sense that we have a really, really high quality open source community. So sort of in the grander scheme of things, Weaviate is relatively new technologies, and it's still small compared to what it's going to grow to at some point. So our Slack channel that we have, I think it's just crossed around 1,000 users or so. That's certainly smaller than the, I don't know, Kubernetes Slack, for example. But it's a super, super high quality community. We're super happy. We see that these people are actually using Weaviate in production, or if they're not using it in production, then they're using it sort of with the goal to get to production. They're evaluating it, how they're going to use it. And we see this from the kind of issues they run into, and in the kind of usage pattern, that this is really not just someone sort of superficially interested, but really, really, really a high quality community. And now you should think, well, if you have that kind of great community so close by, it should be trivially easy to get good feedback, right? Well, yes and no. Yes, we have that target group right at our fingertips. But at the same time, it's surprisingly hard to ask the right questions when you want to get feedback. And something that we noticed over and over again is that if you just pitch an idea, you're not going to get valuable feedback. People are going to say yes to every question. It's about whether they want to have something. And if you ask them how they could use this in this particular case, it's very difficult if you're not super precise about what it is that you're offering, because the user might have different context than you have. So they probably have their problem in mind, and where you have sort of a solution in mind, and whether those two match or not, that can be difficult to find out. So yeah, in summary about our documentation pain points, well, sometimes we forgot about it completely. If we didn't forget about it, sometimes it was rushed, and therefore the quality wasn't as high as it could be. And our developers lacked the context. And yeah, getting feedback is certainly important to us, but it was never really all that easy. And this is something that we recognize. So as I said early on, we believe that we recognize the importance of our documentation. And this was something that kept coming back. So in retrospective, we would say, well, again, we kind of neglected our documentation. Let's do better in the next sprint or in the next cycle. Let's just really improve this. And then this would basically just repeat. This would come back to the next one, and we'd be at the same place again where we'd say like, come on, what can we do? Why isn't our documentation improving? Basically, why aren't we giving it the kind of love and care that it should deserve? And it was in one of those very retrospectives that a team member said something maybe a bit shocking even. Why not write the documentation first and put it in the task description before we even start developing on that feature? And that was certainly a bit of a light bulb moment for me, but I think that wasn't my initial reaction. I was probably caught a bit off guard by this. And my initial reaction was something like, great, that's even more effort now to get something ready to development. Like now we should write the documentation first as well. But, well, kind of like the idea. And I mean, we're agile and we're working in short iterations. Like, why not try it? Why not try it and just see what happens? Like, what would that even mean? I mean, it's super simple. It's really just 2 words, right? Documentation first, and you just write the documentation before something else. Okay, that's it. Well, it's there's a bit more to it, and we gave it a shot. And what we did is essentially the following. So it's sort of an attempt to define documentation first beyond those just 2 words. So the obvious one first, write the end user facing documentation first and include it in the story card or task description. So important here, the end user facing one. And on this slide, you basically see a screenshot of an actual GitHub issue that we used for this particular feature. So Weaviate being a whole database, this is something, a feature where users wanted to delete objects from that database in batch if it matches a specific query. So I purposely picked this example because it's sort of, you understand what it means, but at the same time, it's not super trivial. Like there will be plenty turning knobs that you can turn. So this is a feature that, in my opinion, really depends on and really benefits from a high quality documentation. So this was one of the first. I'm not sure if it was the first, but it was one of the first features where we tried this out. And as part of that task description, we put in the sort of documentation as if we wanted to serve this to the user. I think there's even a note in there saying like, hey, this feature was made available in version blah, 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 1.13 or so, I believe. Then, in addition to just putting the documentation here, we strive to put the right amount of detail in there, and the right amount of detail both for the developer as well as for the end user. So in this example, this is the same feature where you delete objects with this batch delete query. And in this particular example, you can control the output by setting it either to minimal or to verbose. And minimal would basically be sort of the Unix philosophy where it's completely silent if everything is all right. And if something went wrong, then there would be some sort of an error. And verbose would be the opposite, where in verbose, you would have all the IDs, all the statuses, everything basically that you would need. And this is an example of info that the user needs to know what the flags do. And this is also an example of what the developer needs to know how to build this. Like, what exactly should happen if I build this? Like, minimal verbose, okay, but what happens in minimal? What happens in the case of verbose? And this is an example from that same story card. I'm currently in the process of writing a blog post about something that's called product engineering. And this is not a new concept that we invented. It's a concept that already exists. There are, like, I think, about 2 or so great blog posts about this. And it's about the sort of merger or blurring the lines between product management and engineering, and on purpose, like not as a side effect, but basically on purpose, make sure that engineers always act in the best interest of the product. Naturally, as a small startup founder, that is something that's super important to me. And basically make sure that your engineers are capable of taking these kind of decisions, like take pragmatic decisions in the interest of the product every day, not have that kind of dependency to the product manager to go back and forth for things that in the bigger picture really just don't matter. Like, do it for the things that do matter. Free up the product manager's time to work on the big picture, on the things that's really going to move the needle for the product or for the business. So that said, it's okay to leave gaps in that documentation. Like, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to sort of do this waterfall approach where we now try to figure out every nitty-gritty detail and put it in the documentation. It's absolutely acceptable to leave those gaps. As an example here in Weaviate, we have two APIs, a REST API and a GraphQL API. And in this particular example, those APIs were defined, but we also have language clients for Java, JavaScript, Golang, and Python, of course, Python being a very big language in the AI first space. And yeah, these follow some kind of design guidelines, and there's no point in putting them in here right now. That was the kind of gap that we left in that exact ticket to be filled out later on during development. Here is possibly the biggest of the four principles. If at all possible, make sure that you render this documentation in its final output form. So what does that mean? In the first principle, I had a screenshot where the documentation was just part of that GitHub ticket, basically the GitHub task description, or GitHub issue is the name. But also strive to make this renderable so that you can create that documentation on the fly and basically serve it to users. So in our CI pipeline for the documentation, we have, I believe we're deploying this to Netlify to have these kind of ephemeral environments where you can just deploy a branch or your staging setup just to somewhere basically, and then you get a link back and you can preview it, and then you can share that link and sort of pass it around, both internally, but also to stakeholders. And that is super important, that you can use the documentation to get that kind of feedback. So to put the four previous slides into some sort of a definition, basically. For documentation first development, write the documentation as part of the story card or task description with an appropriate amount of context. You can leave gaps to be filled in later, but make it possible to render the docs to get early feedback. So yeah, that's what we've been doing since. And of course, we've gathered quite a bit of experience with this. So let me share some of the things, yeah, that went wrong or that went great, or kind of how we change this, how we do it, how we use it. Basically, our experience with this documentation first approach. Let me get one thing straight first. Do we use this pattern all the time? Do we use it religiously? Is this like the hard rule? Well, no. It's a tool. It's a tool in our toolbox that we have now. And as with any tool, you should always use the right tool for the right job. And if it fits, if it can help you, if you have these pain points, then use it. If you don't have those pain points, or if you think that the feature is maybe not big enough or too big, just be pragmatic about it. Like, don't try to force it just because it's some new kind of a pattern. Use it if you see use in it, basically, if you see value in it. And that kind of value is also what the user wants to get out of your features. So put yourself in the shoes of the user and see how would the user use that feature. So if you start writing the documentation, let's say you're convinced that your feature is super easy to use, then it should also come natural to write the documentation, right? If it's easy to use, it should be easy to write the documentation. How often have you been in a situation where you started writing the documentation and basically just discovered edge cases the moment that you were describing them, because that happened to be the first time that you were actually describing those edge cases in detail? So sometimes this doesn't matter. I mean, just be agile, like fix it along the way, iterate. Sometimes it does matter. Like if this uncovers that something in your design just wasn't right from the get-go, that is a great point to notice this. Notice it early. So if you put yourself in the perspective of the user when you write the documentation, you will benefit from making sure basically the feature is really ready and really does what you want it to do before it's built, when it's still cheaper to change, basically. Quite naturally, because of this, it became impossible to forget it. Like if we say, okay, the ticket is only ready if it has the documentation, or at least some sort of a path to the documentation, then it's impossible to forget it. And it's much, much harder to rush, basically. You have the time that you prepare for the story card. You can take that time to also prepare the documentation and really make sure that you give it the time and attention where it makes sense. Of course, sometimes it's not going to make sense. Sometimes it's going to make a lot of sense. And those are the kind of cases that we want to catch with this. If we think about the development process itself, if you have a documentation snippet that is written for a user, you have a very, very good basis to translate that into an acceptance test. So of course, there's a lot of overlap here with BDD style. In BDD style, sometimes you have this sort of slightly contrived examples with the sort of given when then statement where users are not really sure what to put where. So you kind of try to force it. Same as with user stories, where you always try to append a so that to kind of highlight the user value. And sometimes that statement just doesn't make sense. So you just put in something and you end up with these like really weird statements that just don't read natural. If you instead use that documentation snippet that tells you what the code or the product is supposed to do, you have a very good basis to build your tests from. So if you're doing test-driven development, this is perfect to build those tests right in the beginning. If you're using other approaches, you can still build them at the end, but it helps you to write those tests, and at the same time, it helps you being the developer in this case, gives you the right amount of context that you need to really build this feature in the way that it was intended. And yeah, possibly the biggest one, as I already hinted at before, if you can get the documentation rendered and send that link to your user, the user is going to forget for a moment that the feature doesn't exist yet. They're reading the documentation. It's the same kind of documentation that they're reading when they're actually using the product. So to them in that moment, it feels like, yeah, it's here. Like, can I actually use it? Going through like, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Or like, this is like, okay, how would I use it? So they will give you feedback, or they at least have a much, much better basis to give you honest feedback, both on the product, by the way, on the feature decision, and also on the documentation, because it could also be that the feature is built right, but the documentation that you drafted isn't good. So again, thinking about the rushing it here, this is a much earlier point to fix that documentation. But yeah, it's not all sort of, this is the holy grail and now everything is fixed. There were definitely a couple of challenges, and I want to share some of them with you, and also try to generalize on them if you want to use these kind of patterns. Something that you need to figure out, or maybe you have figured this out, is who even writes the documentation. Is it the product manager? Is it the engineer? Do you have a DevRel team? Maybe we have an amazing one, by the way. Do you have a dedicated writer maybe who can take care of the documentation? And then if it is someone else who's maybe not part of the team that otherwise builds the feature, are you suddenly introducing this kind of dependency chain where now we can only get the feature ready if the dedicated writer has started writing the documentation? Or is this maybe a dependency chain that was already there, but that wasn't visible? Or do you maybe have something else where you say, like, this is the handover point to hand this to the dedicated writer? So for example, you could do a documentation first light approach, where what you hand over is maybe not the finished documentation, because only someone else in the team can really sort of get the documentation right. But maybe it's just like your bullet points that turn into the documentation, or a first draft where someone else will still make it prettier. And then at least you would still benefit from the kind of context. And then you could still make sure that whatever you hand to this person is the same thing that you hand to the development team, basically, that this matches. And then you have the guarantee, or have it much more likely, that these things are in line. Something that's really a big one is the kind of CI/CD maturity that you have, not just on your product itself. That is something we're luckily we were quite good at with Weaviate from the beginning, but on the documentation also. So for us, the documentation, and this was kind of the pattern here, it was always a bit neglected here and there, and that also showed in the kind of setup. So we were building the documentation, I think we're still building it in Ruby. So this is I think Jekyll-based build, and this kind of just grew, and we added more and more and more, and we had a CI pipeline that would automatically be deployed. But all of a sudden, that CI pipeline took 25 minutes or even more. I think I just took one of the screenshots here, but I think there were times where it took even longer. That is no longer fun. That takes the whole fun out of anything that you want to feel sort of fast feedback cycles and feel it fast paced and get immediate feedback. 25 minutes is not immediate feedback. I mean, 25 minutes is better than a day, but 25 minutes is just too long. So recently our DevRel team worked on this and improved the setup and introduced caching and stripped stuff from the build that just didn't need to be there. And now this is at 7 minutes. Still not the greatest time in the world. Of course, for immediate feedback, it's even better if it's quicker, but so much better to have the 7-minute build as opposed to a 25-minute build. And this is vital if you're doing anything, especially for documentation first. If you would be the person that would write the documentation, and you, I don't know, maybe on a day you dedicate 3 hours to write 3 story cards in plenty of detail, and then you also want to write the documentation, and then you submit the first one and you have to wait 25 minutes. That's just not going to make you happy. So this is something that if you want to go this approach, but also in general, if you want your documentation to be good, make sure that it's as easy to develop on it as possible, that you have the best possible developer experience. And the whole CI/CD mindset, of course, absolutely helps with that. Yeah, engineering is about trade-offs. That's how it's always been, basically. And if you say, and this was kind of my fear in the beginning, that if I write the documentation, the moment that I write the story card, it's going to take me more time. Well, yes, it does. If you do more, it's probably going to take more time. But this time, this is an investment that you make. You're going to get it back, and you're going to get it back multiple times, either in not having to rush these things in the last minute, or you get it back as in better documentation because you have the dedicated time. And as my team member basically said when he proposed this kind of idea, is like, would you rather write this when it's already stressful, or would you just sort of have a bit more work up front but have all the time in the world for it? And he kind of had a point, and I'm absolutely with him on this. The last challenge that we saw, so this is maybe not so much a documentation first challenge, but since we're talking about documentation challenges already, it's definitely one where I believe we made a couple of big mistakes that we're now fixing. So when you build up this documentation incrementally in the same way that you build up the features in the product, it can become quite easy to just sort of build the documentation structure in the exact same way. So basically feature 1, feature 2, feature 3. And we kind of were in that kind of scenario where at some point the documentation was basically pick the API type, pick the API endpoint, and then we're going to tell you what it does. And that is great for an API reference, but documentation is so much more than an API reference. So now we're fixing this by really considering the user flows. How does the user use the documentation? What do they want to do? How do they approach it? Where do they go? What do they select? What is it that they want to do? What value do they want to get out of Weaviate? And that is something that I believe should structure the documentation, and not something that we did in the beginning, but something that now, as we're growing the whole company and growing our DevRel team as well, something that we're finally addressing. So before we close this, one thing that I said in the beginning is that we could see if this documentation first approach, if that would also work with other kinds of documentation. So far, we've talked about the end user facing documentation. And that was initially, that was my entire goal. But as I started preparing for this talk, at some point I was like, wait, didn't we actually use the same kind of pattern for something that's not end user facing documentation? And turns out we did. So we built, pretty recently, we built a backup feature for Weaviate. So you can imagine backing up an entire database. That is sort of a big thing. Like we made it, or we believe we made it in a way that's super easy to use for a user, where from a user-facing perspective, it's not a big thing. It's a simple sort of one-off command. But the stuff that's going on internally with all the stores, and in Weaviate, you have the object store, and then you also have the vector store, and that all needs to be synchronized and sort of kept together. So from an engineering perspective, this was no small feat. And it was one of those kind of things where the whole team would get together and we would have some kind of a planning session in the beginning, and we would outline, okay, we're going to build this in this particular component, and we're going to build that in that particular component. And then somehow these two code components, they have to talk to each other. So you would define interfaces and basically define the coupling and what you don't want to be coupled. And at some point, there's basically, okay, this is the interface, and something needs to implement that interface at some particular point. And for this, we weren't aware that we did it, but we still did it. We did the documentation first approach. We defined what the interface would look like, and we put code level docs on top of the interface methods, basically, and we wrote it as if the feature already existed. Like, this is what this thing does. Here it is. Like, basically, in the same way that you could use AI tools to generate code right now. You just write the code doc comment and it would build it for you. Unfortunately, no AI could build this feature for us. We had to hand build it. But nevertheless, this is exactly how we use this pattern, and something that I only realized as part of preparing for this talk, that we use documentation first also on code level documentation. Yeah, so let me recap basically the past 35 minutes into a single slide. Writing documentation before development of a feature is a way to ensure documentation quality, and also a way to ensure feature quality. It allows for early feedback and quick iteration cycles, same here, both on the feature itself and on the documentation. By removing ambiguity from story cards, it can even improve feature quality. It will force you to improve your documentation steps and workflow. So this is the CI/CD part. That is something that I personally value quite a bit. And yeah, on that note, thank you very much for attending this talk about documentation first. I'm super curious if there are any questions or comments from the audience. If you do want to learn more about either what we do as a company, how we act, what Weaviate does, other than that sort of 2-minute introduction in the beginning, you can follow us you can join our Slack community that I praised before. You can follow us on YouTube, on Twitter, on LinkedIn also, which isn't on the slide. We have a Weaviate podcast where I've been a guest there for a couple of times. We have plenty of cool guests from external parties, basically from other companies that either work with us or that are thought leaders in the space. So that's super cool if you're interested in kind of the AI first search space. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, where I'm also going to post the slides here later. So in case you want to look at them again, that is your opportunity to do that. Nothing left for me to do but to say thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm super curious to hear them and hopefully answer them.
You cannot hear it right now, but the people are clapping for you. So just imagine.
Yay, thank you.
So
thank you.
Are there any questions left? I think you made it pretty clear for the audience here, as well for your remote audience. So there's not a lot left to say. Then thank you very much, Etienne. Thank you very much for taking the time and for your presentation. And yeah, so I wish you a great day. And we see each other again in the next conference, I guess.
Awesome. Let's do that.
Cool.
Have a great day, everyone.
Then see you then. Bye.
Bye.